God as in the Torah, as we know of God's ways to us in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. So, and I think this is marvellous the way he's described it, we find a prophet clearly critiquing the culture in which he finds himself, saying where it's deviating from God's plan, and then he energizes people with the hope of what might be if we follow God's plan. Now, interestingly, I find he says about conservatives and liberals in the world today, the conservatives tend to focus on the future, what God's plan is, and they forget to critique the society they're living in. And liberals are happy to critique the contemporary situation, but they fail to really energize us with a vision of what God's hope for the future is. I find that pretty interesting. Okay, let's go now to the third thing we're trying to do today. What does the prophetic literature in the Jewish scriptures look like? For us Christians, when we look at the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, we tend to break them up into 3 groups. The historical books, the prophetic books, the wisdom books. Well, our Jewish brothers and sisters has a vastly different conception of what Scripture is. For them, a fundamental importance is the Torah, the law, which of course is the first 5 books of the Scriptures: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. What we call the Pentateuch. For our Jewish brothers and sisters, the Torah is God's norm for how we're meant to live. Everything else is secondary. And for them, then of next importance, secondary importance if you like, are the prophetic books, which interpret the norm, the Torah, in the historical circumstances the Jewish people find themselves in. And this prophetic literature includes the prophets, that we call prophets, but also the historical books, which at first really surprises us: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. These are included from the Jewish perspective because we're not just looking at history, we're looking at history from the viewpoint of God, from the viewpoint of God's vision for us, which we find in the Torah. And then the next group of books in the Jewish scriptures are the writings they're called. And it consists of the Jewish literature after the exile, in the last 400 years or so before Jesus. The prophetic canon of the Jewish Bible has 8 books: the former prophets and the latter prophets. The 4 books of the former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And the 4 books of the latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 4th book is called the 12 minor prophets. Now, Walter Brueggemann would put it like this: the former prophets tell the narrative of the land loss, the exile, once the River Jordan has been crossed, a tale commensurate with the Torah narrative of land gift. And the latter prophets make the move beyond land loss into the post-exilic period. Walter Brueggemann is a key representative of a method of Jewish scripture study we call canonical criticism. And it's really become very, very important in the last 20 years or so. this method of looking at the Old Testament looks at the Jewish canon of Scripture as it comes to us in its final editorial form. And that's about the 4th or 3rd century BC. His focus, and the focus of all who follow this way of looking at the Scriptures, when it comes to the book of Isaiah, looks at it as a complete work, the final version of the book. And they would see it as a single work with a clear message, ultimately put together in a powerful way by the communities of the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. But we're going to look now at how that book was composed. So we're going to look now at what the book of Isaiah does look like, in fact. Well, it's 66 chapters long. It's the longest of the prophetic books, and it's the first in the latter prophets. Interestingly, it's the only complete scroll we have among the 220 biblical scrolls found at Qumran. Qumran was discovered just after the Second World War, and it contains an extraordinary amount of scrolls written in the 1st century BC and into the 1st century AD. It's a wonderful discovery. So whatever we find there has been able to influence our understanding of the Jewish Scriptures immeasurably. And we can say that Isaiah was clearly the favourite prophet of the Qumran community, who were living, of course, at the time of Jesus. Until the 19th century, most people thought Isaiah, the prophet, wrote the whole book. But in 1892, a German, Bernhard Dumm, published a work of criticism which was widely accepted and which said that the book really is composed of 3 different sections. The first one, chapters 1 to 39, is basically from the prophet Isaiah himself and comes from around the year 730 to 700 BC. The second section, chapters 40 to 55, come from a later prophet, a marvellous prophet, whom we tend to call these days Second Isaiah. And he lives at the end of the exile, a good 150 years later than Isaiah. And then the third section, chapters 56 to 66, are even later than that. Let's try to take a look now at how the book itself took shape. Isaiah was a major figure in the late 8th century BC, 730s to 701. He was probably a court prophet, certainly a highly placed inhabitant, citizen of Jerusalem. And despite later additions and rearrangements of chapters 1 to 39, his basic message comes very loud and clear across to us today, especially in chapters 1 to 12, in chapters 28 to 31, and 36 to 39. And that spans over the 40 years of his ministry, in that troubled time when the Assyrians were the world power, Assyria, with Nineveh as their capital. There's a lot of debate about whether Isaiah founded a school of prophets or not, or whether he had a group of disciples, all that sort of stuff. Certainly, when second Isaiah came on the scene in the 540s BC, we have an extraordinary prophet whose poetry recaptures the same vision as Isaiah and a lot of his language, but whose work is really a little different. It's like a majestic hymn to God